We're losing birds faster than we can count them, and humans are behind almost every extinction. Birds are fading into oblivion, leaving behind only final pictures.
She was the last passenger pigeon in existence. She died in September of 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo and was shipped to the Smithsonian in a big block of ice by railroad.
Images captured by cameras since the 1800s that are now the last echoes of what once soared freely. Each one tells a story of loss, of nature undone by human hands, of species that had existed for millennia, reduced to a single frozen frame. Some of these stories involve famous last individuals with names, documented deaths, and exact dates.
That's the last male of a species.
Others are murkier, a species that simply faded away until one day ornithologists realized they were searching for something that no longer existed. Join us as we walk through the last photographs of extinct birds. The great auk. The great auk was not a penguin, though it looked remarkably like one, standing nearly 3 feet tall, completely flightless, and once spread across the North Atlantic in colonies where they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Because they could not fly or run on land, hunters had only to herd them onto ships by the thousands, killing some for meat and sometimes burning their oil-rich bodies as fuel when firewood ran short. What happened on July 3, 1844, is one of the most precise and devastating endings in natural history. Museum collectors in Europe hired 3 Icelandic fishermen and sent them to LD Island with a single assignment: bring back the last living great auks on Earth. When the men reached the cliffs, they found the final pair standing beside their only egg. The birds were seized, killed with bare hands, and the egg was crushed underfoot by accident. For this, the men were paid roughly $100. A species was gone in a single morning, and the final known photograph of a living great auk, unearthed years later, turned that transaction into one of the most devastating moments ever captured on film. Today, all that remains are their preserved bodies in museum collections, each one a $100 relic of a morning that should never have happened. The laughing owl. Walking through New Zealand at night about a century ago, you'd hear what sounded like a person laughing in the darkness. Except it wasn't human, it was this owl. The laughing owl nested in rocky caves instead of trees, hunting through the night and making maniacal shrieks that genuinely sounded like human laughter, echoing across empty landscapes. Early European settlers found the call deeply unsettling, a sound that didn't fit the darkness around it. When they brought cats, rats, and stoats, those predators raided nests relentlessly, and the owl's population fell faster than anyone was tracking. Some settlers hunted the owls directly, possibly because that laugh in the dark made them uncomfortable in a way they couldn't quite explain. By the early 1900s, sightings had become rare enough to alarm naturalists. The last confirmed specimen was collected in 1914, and hikers reported hearing that distinctive call through the 1920s and 30s, but no one could ever prove it. The final photographs show a creature with a small, round head and enormous dark eyes that looks almost comical in daylight, the kind of face that makes it very hard to understand why anyone would have wanted it gone. The paradise parrot. Called one of the most beautiful parrots on Earth, the paradise parrot flashed turquoise, red, yellow, and green through Queensland's grasslands like a living rainbow. And it made one fatal evolutionary mistake that sealed its fate long before humans came along to finish the job. While most parrots nest safely in tree hollows, the paradise parrot carved its chambers inside termite mounds sitting directly on the ground, leaving eggs and chicks exposed to every predator that passed. They survived that arrangement for thousands of years, but when a catastrophic drought struck in 1902, the population collapsed almost overnight. By the 1920s, spotting one had become nearly impossible, and ornithologists could sense the end was approaching. The last confirmed photograph, taken in 1922, shows a paradise parrot slipping into its termite mound nest, a bird disappearing into a hole in the ground, in what would become its species' final image. By 1950, they were officially declared extinct. That single photograph is all we have left of a bird that burned through the grasslands in every color the eye could want. The Kauai-o'o. After his mate was killed in a hurricane, the last male Kauai-o'o spent 5 years singing alone in the forest, calling for a female who would never come, and someone recorded his desperate song before he vanished forever. The Kauai-o'o was a black honey creeper with yellow thigh feathers that had lived in Hawaii's mountain forests for thousands of years. feeding on arthropods and fruits and filling the valleys with music. When European settlers brought mosquitoes carrying avian malaria, the population collapsed through the 1970s and 80s. By 1981, only a single breeding pair remained. Then a hurricane tore through Kauai and killed the female. For the next 5 years, the male kept singing his mating call across an empty forest, a haunting, looping whistle that evolved over millennia as a duet, now reduced to one voice waiting for an answer that was never coming. In 1987, a researcher recorded him one final time. He was never seen or heard again. That recording exists online, and if you listen to it knowing what you're hearing, it is one of the most affecting sounds in the entire archive of natural history. The passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeons were the most abundant bird species that has ever existed on this planet, with migrating flocks so vast they took 3 days to pass overhead and turned the sky black for miles. Yet within the span of a single human lifetime, they were gone entirely, and the last one had a name. They nested in colonies covering 850 square miles, sometimes packing 100 nests into a single tree, and early accounts describe the sound of a passing flock as something like sustained thunder. Settlers saw them as unlimited protein, and the slaughter was industrial. 50,000 birds killed in a single day was not unusual, with carcasses piled into wagons and shipped to city markets by the trainload. By 1900, the last wild passenger pigeon had been shot in Ohio. Martha was born around 1885 in a Chicago breeding program, and eventually arrived at the Cincinnati Zoo with 2 male companions, but both males died by 1910, and she lived on alone, growing weaker after a stroke, observed by zoo visitors who had no idea they were watching the last of her kind. She was found dead on her cage floor on September 1st, 1914. Zoo staff immediately froze her in a 300-pound block of ice and rushed her to the Smithsonian, where her mounted body still stands today, a reminder that abundance means nothing at all when you push a species too far, too fast. The ivory-billed woodpecker. The ivory-billed woodpecker was America's largest woodpecker, 20 inches long with a 30-inch wingspan and a gleaming white bill that looked almost too large for its head, and it needed something that humans were not willing to leave alone. Vast tracts of ancient, old-growth forest filled with recently dead trees where beetle larvae could thrive. When logging companies swept through the American South in the early 1900s, clear-cutting those forests as fast as machines would allow, the woodpecker's habitat shrank catastrophically and irreversibly. By the 1920s, only scattered populations clung on in remote swamps. Ornithologist James Tanner photographed and filmed a small group in Louisiana's Singer Tract during the 1930s, creating the last confirmed images of the species alive. Footage that logging companies were shown and ignored, continuing to cut the tract anyway. After that, every claimed sighting sparked a debate that has never fully resolved itself. In 2004, a kayaker in Arkansas claimed to have seen one, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service launched an extensive search that found nothing definitive. Whether it is truly extinct or surviving in some fragment of untouched swamp is a question ornithologists cannot answer with certainty, which may be the most haunting thing about it. The Carolina parakeet. Incas, the last Carolina parakeet, died in the same cage where Martha the passenger pigeon had died 4 years earlier. And some people have noted, grimly, that the Cincinnati Zoo had become a kind of graveyard where America's most irreplaceable birds went to vanish forever. The Carolina parakeet was the only parrot native to the eastern United States, a flash of green, yellow, and orange that nested in tree cavities from Florida to New York and descended on fruit orchards in screeching flocks. Farmers hated them for the crop damage, but what truly sealed their fate was a behavioral quirk that made them impossibly easy to kill. When one bird was shot, the rest would circle back to check on it rather than flee, allowing hunters to keep firing into the same group until there was nothing left to circle. That loyalty, combined with habitat loss and likely disease from domestic poultry, erased them from the wild by the early 1900s. Incas lived at the Cincinnati Zoo with his mate Lady Jane, but she died in 1917. He survived her by less than a year, found dead on February 21, 1918, in the same aviary that had held Martha. The Cincinnati Zoo had witnessed the end of 2 species in 4 years, in the same cage, and barely anyone outside the ornithology world noticed. If these stories are hitting the way we hoped, go ahead and like the video. It helps more people find these stories, and these birds deserve to be remembered. We're not even close to done yet. The heath hen The heath hen story is one of the cruelest in extinction history, not because humans failed to notice the problem, but because they noticed, built a reserve, watched the population climb back to 2,000 birds, and then lost them anyway, disaster by disaster, until only one was left. Heath hens were a subspecies of prairie chicken that had been hunted so heavily along the eastern seaboard that they'd vanished from the mainland by the 1870s. Conservationists established a reserve on Martha's Vineyard, and for a time it worked spectacularly. The population surged to 2,000 by 1916, a genuine conservation success story. Then a wildfire in that same year incinerated most of them. The survivors faced an abnormally brutal winter. An invasion of goshawks moved through and picked off what remained. By the 1920s, mostly males had survived, and inbreeding weakened each successive generation. Eventually, only one remained, Booming Ben, who spent his final years alone on the reserve, performing his courtship display to an empty field every spring, stamping his feet, puffing his neck feathers, booming across a landscape with no one to hear it. He was last seen on March 11, 1932. Searchers looked for years and found nothing. He had kept calling long after there was any reason to call, which is either the saddest or the most dignified ending in this entire list, depending on how you look at it. The Laysan rail. The Laysan rail was a thumb-sized flightless bird that had evolved over thousands of years on a Pacific island with no predators, and the last one died on Midway Atoll during World War II, when the soldiers stationed there accidentally introduced the same rats that had already destroyed everything the bird had once been. The Laysan rail lived on Laysan Island in Hawaii, a speck of land where life had seemed perfectly balanced around 1900. With nothing to threaten them, these tiny birds had long since lost the ability to fly, scurrying across the sand like miniature shadows. Then, in 1903, rabbits were brought to the island for commercial purposes and ate the vegetation down to bare ground. Rats arrived shortly after and devoured eggs and chicks. By 1923, the species was extinct on Laysan itself, but scientists had relocated some rails to Midway Atoll in 1891 and again in 1913, where they had thrived for decades and seemed safe. During World War II, military construction on Midway brought new rat populations, and by 1944, the rails were gone there too. There is haunting film footage of the last individual, a lone bird running across the sand, and watching it, you are watching the final moments of a species that had survived intact for millennia, until the specific combination of human decisions that ended it in a few decades arrived all at once. The dusky seaside sparrow. Orange Band was the last one left, named for the colored tag on his leg, watching hybrid sparrows that looked almost but not quite like him move through the enclosure around him. And when he died on June 16, 1987, he took an entire species with him. The dusky seaside sparrow lived in Florida's coastal salt marshes near Cape Canaveral, until NASA decided to build a space center in the area, and the surrounding land required mosquito control. Managers flooded the marshes with pesticides, and the sparrows started dying. By 1980, scientists could locate only 6 individuals, and every single one was male, which meant the species was functionally finished regardless of what anyone did next. Biologists attempted crossbreeding with Scott's seaside sparrows to preserve at least some of the genetic material, but Orange Band was the last pure dusky, and he could not be saved. He spent his final years at Disney's Discovery Island, surrounded by birds that resembled him without being him, watching a version of his species that wasn't his species, until the day he didn't wake up, and an entire lineage that had existed for thousands of years simply ended. The Pauli. Scientists discovered the Pauli in 1973, and by 2004 it was extinct. 31 years from first sighting to complete disappearance, the fastest watched extinction in recorded history, and most people on Earth never knew it had existed at all. Students hiking through Maui's remote mountain forests stumbled across a small black-faced honeycreeper that no one had ever documented before. By the time the scientific world understood what had been found, the species was already in its final chapter, trapped in shrinking forest fragments by introduced predators, habitat loss, and avian disease that had been working through Hawaiian birds for decades. By 2004, only 3 individuals could be located, scattered across different valleys, too far apart to find each other. Scientists captured one male hoping to attempt breeding, but he died in captivity within days. Searches for the remaining 2 turned up nothing. Think carefully about what that timeline means. A species survived undiscovered in those forests for thousands of years, stayed completely hidden from Western science until 1973, and then disappeared so completely before most people knew it existed that it barely registered as a loss. That is how fast we are losing birds now. The Guadalupe caracara. The Guadalupe caracara was one of the few birds in history that humans hunted to extinction deliberately, systematically, and without any apparent hesitation. A bold, brown and cream hawk that had the fatal quality of being completely unafraid of people. These raptors lived only on Guadalupe Island off Mexico, originally feeding on seal and sea lion colonies that bred on the island in enormous numbers. When hunters slaughtered those animals nearly to extinction in the 1800s, the caracaras adapted to eating young goats instead, which made them enemies of the island's herders. What followed was a coordinated campaign of poisoning and shooting that reduced their numbers to almost nothing within a generation. When museum collector Rollo Beck arrived on Guadalupe Island in December of 1900, he found 11 birds. He shot 9 of them for specimens and left 2 alive. Someone reported seeing a single bird in 1903 and then nothing. By 1906, they were gone. Beck didn't cause the extinction. The goat herders had done most of the work already. But his collection visit finished it, and the Guadalupe caracara became one of a very short list of species that humans chose to end completely and on purpose. The Stevens Island wren. The Stevens Island wren was discovered and completely destroyed within a single year, possibly by one lighthouse keeper's cat, making it the only species in history known to have been driven to extinction by a single domestic animal, though the full truth is slightly more complicated and not much more reassuring. When workers built a lighthouse on Stevens Island, New Zealand in 1894, they found a tiny bird hopping through the low scrub like a mouse, something no scientist had ever encountered. The lighthouse keeper's cat, Tibbles, started hunting them and bringing carcasses back to the house. The keeper was an amateur naturalist named David Lyle, who recognized the birds might be scientifically significant and sent specimens to museums in New Zealand and Britain. By 1895, every wren on the island was dead. Some historians believe feral cats brought by the construction crew were the real culprits, and that Tibbles has been unfairly blamed, but the outcome is identical regardless. A species that had evolved in complete isolation for thousands of years was eliminated within months of humans' first arrival on the island. Only 15 museum specimens exist worldwide. No living Stevens Island wren was ever photographed. The Aleotra grebe. The Aleotra grebe lived its entire existence on a single lake in Madagascar, Lake Aleotra, the island's largest, building floating nests, diving for small fish, and perfectly adapted to a world that was essentially the entire universe for this species. Then people introduced snakehead fish into the lake, hoping to build a commercial fishery. Scientists warned clearly that the snakeheads would devastate the existing ecosystem, but no one in a position to act was listening. The snakeheads ate through the grebe's food supply and likely attacked the birds themselves, while monofilament fishing nets set across the lake began drowning the survivors. The last confirmed sighting came in 1985. Researchers searched for years afterward and found nothing. The species was officially declared extinct in 2010, a quarter century after anyone had seen one. It is a very specific kind of extinction, a species that existed nowhere else on Earth, destroyed not by malice or ignorance of its existence, but by a fishery decision made with full scientific warning about the consequences, and ignored anyway. If you're watching this and thinking about the birds still out there on the edge, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We cover stories like these because they need to be told. The Spix's macaw. The last wild Spix's macaw was so alone that he started flying with a female blue-winged macaw, a completely different species, because she was the only bird on Earth that looked even remotely like him, and they would travel together every day until one day in 2000, he simply vanished and was never seen again. The Spix's macaw was a striking cobalt blue parrot from Brazil's northeastern interior, nesting in cariba trees along creek valleys in one of the most specific habitat requirements of any parrot species. Pet traders captured them heavily throughout the mid-20th century, and the destruction of their woodland habitat removed what was left. By the 1990s, only this single male remained in the wild near a small town in Bahia, watched by conservationists who could do nothing except hope a female would appear somewhere. None did. The partnership he formed with the blue-winged macaw, a strange, heartbreaking arrangement born entirely from having no other option, became the defining image of what it looks like when a species reaches the absolute end of itself. About 180 Spix's macaws survive in captivity now, and recent reintroduction attempts have started. But whether birds raised in enclosures can survive in forests transformed beyond what their ancestors knew remains deeply uncertain. The spectacled cormorant. The spectacled cormorant was the largest cormorant species that ever existed, weighing up to 14 pounds, with distinctive white rings around the eyes that looked like spectacles. And the fact that it couldn't fly made it, from a sailor's perspective, simply food that hadn't been collected yet. It lived only on Bering Island in Russia, having evolved over thousands of years on a remote shore with no natural predators, which is exactly the kind of evolutionary history that makes an animal completely defenseless the moment humans arrive with a club. Georg Wilhelm Steller first described them in 1741, when his expedition was shipwrecked there, and at the time they crowded the rocky shores in huge numbers, so tame that approaching them required no strategy at all. Fur traders and sailors quickly understood that these giant birds couldn't escape and tasted fine, and within a century the cormorants had been reduced from a thriving island species to a handful of museum specimens. The last confirmed sighting came around 1852, roughly 100 years after Steller first described them. Only a small number of museum specimens remain today, each one a record of a bird that evolution had made perfectly suited for its world and perfectly helpless in ours. The pink-headed duck. From the moment scientists first formally described the pink-headed duck in 1790, it was already rare, scattered across wetlands in India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, its soft rose-colored head making it unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen one. That pale pink distinguished it immediately, but the birds had a strange defense mechanism that worked against them. Rather than flying when threatened, they would dive underwater and hide, which made them easy targets for hunters who simply waited. British colonists drained their wetlands and hunted them directly, and the last confirmed sighting came from India in 1949. But the mystery of this species has never fully closed, because these ducks were primarily nocturnal, most active in darkness, which made reliable observation nearly impossible even when they were common. And even today, local people in the remote swamps of northern Myanmar report seeing pink-headed ducks in areas so inaccessible that no scientist has been able to verify the claims. The IUCN officially lists them as critically endangered rather than extinct, precisely because those swamps are vast enough and unexplored enough that certainty is impossible. The pink-headed duck exists in a strange limbo, probably gone, possibly not, and no one can say for certain which. The huia. The huia was the only bird species on Earth where males and females had evolved completely different beak shapes. The males short and straight for hammering into dead wood, the females long and curved for probing deep crevices. So pairs hunted as coordinated teams, each doing what the other could not. A partnership refined over thousands of years of isolation in New Zealand's forests. Maori chiefs prized their white-tipped tail feathers as status symbols and had taken them from dead birds sustainably for centuries. Then European collectors arrived and began offering cash, and the dynamic changed completely. Hunters drove deep into the forests and killed them in massive numbers, while logging companies simultaneously destroyed the old-growth habitat the huia needed, and rats introduced by European ships devoured the eggs. The last confirmed sighting came in 1907. The tail feathers that had made them sacred in Maori culture and desirable to European collectors became the precise instrument of their destruction. A species whose most beautiful feature was the thing that drew the most lethal attention. Those magnificent feathers that decorated chiefly cloaks for centuries ended up being what the huia traded its existence for. Bachman's warbler. Bachman's warbler vanished so quietly that nobody is entirely sure when the last one died. There was no famous final bird, no documented last day, no one recording the moment it ended, just a species that faded away like a ghost until ornithologists looked up one day and realized they hadn't seen one in years. The Bachman's warbler was a small migratory songbird that bred in the swampy bottomland forests of the southeastern United States and wintered in Cuba. And it was never particularly common even in historical records, which made tracking its decline nearly impossible until the decline was already terminal. Throughout the 1900s, the swampy forests it depended on were drained and logged across the South, and the warblers simply kept disappearing. The last confirmed sighting in the United States came from South Carolina in 1962. Someone reported seeing one in Cuba in 1981, but nothing was documented after that. Extensive searches across both its breeding and wintering ranges found nothing. The Bachman's warbler slipped away unannounced, without the drama of a famous last individual or a specific final date, which in some ways makes it harder to sit with. A species that simply stopped existing while everyone was paying attention to something else. The Eskimo curlew. The Eskimo curlew completed one of the longest migrations of any shorebird on Earth, from Arctic tundra, breeding grounds all the way to Argentina and back, thousands of miles twice a year. And when they stopped in the Great Plains to rest and feed during that journey, market hunters were waiting with wagons and guns, and no particular limit on what they could take. In the late 1800s, they shot tens of thousands of curlews during each migration season, piling carcasses into wagons headed for city restaurants, while simultaneously the prairie grasslands the curlews depended on for stopover feeding were being converted to farmland at scale. A bird that had survived its extraordinary migration for thousands of years was eliminated not at the end of it, but in the middle of a rest stop. By 1900, they were already rare. The last confirmed specimen was shot in Barbados in 1963. Possible sightings were reported in Texas in the 1980s and in Canada in the early 2000s, but none were ever verified. Like a handful of other species on this list, the Eskimo curlew exists in a state of almost certain extinction, where the final confirmation has never arrived. The Cuban macaw. The Cuban macaw filled Caribbean skies with red, yellow, and blue for centuries, described in massive flocks by Spanish colonists as far back as the 1500s, and it was destroyed so thoroughly and so quickly that no photograph of a living one was ever taken, leaving only museum skins and written descriptions of a bird most of the world never had the chance to see. By the 1800s, the populations were already collapsing under pressure from two directions simultaneously. Wealthy European collectors paid significant sums for exotic parrots, sending traders deep into Cuban forests to capture them alive for shipping overseas, while locals hunted them directly for meat. The macaws also needed large hollow trees for nesting, and deforestation across Cuba eliminated those nesting sites faster than the birds could adapt. The last confirmed wild bird was seen around 1885, though some accounts suggest scattered individuals may have survived into the early 1890s. They are among the most complete ghosts in this entire list, a species we know existed, know we destroyed, and cannot picture because no camera ever found one in time. The New Zealand quail. In 1770, when Captain Cook's expedition documented wildlife across New Zealand, these small ground-dwelling game birds were everywhere across both main islands. And just 105 years after Europeans arrived in numbers, they were gone. The first endemic New Zealand bird species lost to colonization, wiped out before most of the world knew they existed. Joseph Banks documented them during Cook's voyage. At the time, Maori were hunting them sustainably as part of a long-established practice. Then European settlers arrived with everything the New Zealand quail had never encountered in the course of its entire evolutionary history: cats, rats, and stoats that ate eggs and chicks without restraint, a farming culture that cleared massive areas of grassland and bush, destroying the habitat the birds needed, and a hunting culture that took them in large numbers for sport and food without any concept of sustainable limits. These birds had evolved on islands with no mammalian predators, and had no behavioral defenses against what was coming. By the 1860s, sightings had already become unusual. The last confirmed specimen was collected in 1875. The New Zealand quail holds the distinction of being the first endemic New Zealand bird to go extinct, following European colonization, the opening entry in a list that grew considerably longer in the decades that followed. The Guam rail. The Guam rail was living peacefully in Guam's forests when brown tree snakes accidentally arrived on military cargo ships from Australia after World War II. And within a few decades, the snakes had reshaped the island's entire ecology. Nocturnal, relentless climbers that raided every nest they could find, multiplying without limit because nothing on Guam had evolved to control them. The rail population collapsed so fast that by 1987, the species existed only in captivity. 21 birds in a breeding program, while Guam's forests had become almost silent. There is a slight silver lining here, and it is worth noting. captive breeding worked. Rails have been reintroduced to nearby Cocos Island and to sections of Guam where snake populations are actively managed, and the species has not vanished entirely. But not vanished entirely carries its own weight. These are birds that exist only because humans are continuously intervening to keep them alive. In forests they cannot occupy safely, on an island where the predator that took everything from them is still there. It is a provisional survival, a species held at the edge by constant human management, which is both better than extinction and a very different thing from thriving. If you want to keep up with stories like these, share this video. The more people who know, the more people who might actually do something about what's still happening to birds right now. The Labrador duck. The Labrador duck went extinct, and ornithologists still have no idea why, making it one of the most genuinely mysterious disappearances in bird history, a species that simply stopped existing without leaving behind the kind of clear cause that every other extinction on this list provides. The Labrador duck was a small sea duck that lived along the northeastern coast of North America, diving in shallow coastal waters for mollusks. Strangely, it was never particularly common, even in historical accounts, which has made the reconstruction of its decline almost impossible. The last confirmed specimen was shot at Elmira, New York, in 1878. Unlike passenger pigeons or great auks, there is no documented story of industrial-scale hunting or catastrophic habitat loss that explains it. Its flesh was reportedly unappetizing, so it wasn't valued as food. Some theories point to the overharvesting of mussels cutting off its food supply, or to changes in coastal water quality affecting shellfish populations across its range. Others suggest it was simply never numerous enough to absorb whatever pressures it faced. The truth is, we will probably never know what ended the Labrador duck, and that uncertainty, a species gone without explanation, without a villain, without a moment we can point to, makes its absence somehow more unsettling than the extinctions with clear causes. The Choiseul pigeon. The Choiseul pigeon was so completely unafraid of humans that collectors could walk up and lift the birds from their roosts with bare hands. An animal that had never encountered a predator and had no behavioral framework for understanding that something approaching it might want to cause harm. This large, distinctive ground pigeon with a striking blue crest lived on a single Solomon Islands speck, roosting in small groups close to the forest floor. In 1904, collector Albert Stuart Meek encountered 6 adults and collected 1 egg. After that, despite multiple search expeditions, nobody ever saw one again. Only 6 specimens exist in museum collections worldwide to prove the species was ever real. Indigenous people on the island attributed the disappearance to introduced cats, which the pigeon, never having faced a predatory mammal in its evolutionary history, would have had no instinct to avoid or escape. It is a very short story with almost no record and no famous final individual. A species that existed in isolation for thousands of years, encountered humans twice, and was gone. The Oahu Oo. Native Hawaiians prize the Oahu Oo's striking yellow feathers for creating the elaborate cloaks and helmets worn by royalty, feathered garments that required thousands of birds and represented centuries of careful, selective harvesting embedded in cultural practice. The black honeyeater lived in Oahu's mountain forests, feeding on nectar and pollinating native flowers as part of an ecosystem it had helped shape for millennia. In 1837, German naturalist Ferdinand Deppe collected the last known specimens from the hills behind what is now Honolulu. After that, the species was never confirmed again. Here is the particular strangeness of this extinction. When ornithologist John Gould scientifically described and formally named the species in 1860, it had already been extinct for 23 years. He was naming something that no longer existed, working from preserved specimens, describing a bird that the forest had already lost before Western science found the language to record it. The exact cause remains a matter of uncertainty. Feather harvesting at colonial scale, habitat clearing, and European diseases arriving with settlers likely all contributed. But the Oahu Oo was gone before anyone outside Hawaii thought to ask whether it was disappearing. The Mariana mallard. The Mariana mallard didn't get hunted to extinction or poisoned or driven out. It got genetically absorbed, bred out of existence through hybridization with introduced ducks until no pure individuals remained, erased slowly and quietly without a single dramatic moment of loss. The Mariana mallard lived on Pacific islands including Guam. distinct enough to constitute its own subspecies, or possibly a full species. When humans brought domestic mallards and feral ducks to the islands, the Mariana mallards began interbreeding with them, and over successive generations the pure genetic line became increasingly diluted. By the 1970s, conservationists struggled to identify individuals that showed no signs of hybridization. The last apparently pure Mariana mallard was seen around 1981. After that, only hybrids remained, ducks that resembled the original closely enough to be confusing, but weren't the same. It is a form of extinction that leaves no dramatic final photograph, no named last individual, no clear moment of ending. Just a genetic signature fading across a population until one generation it simply wasn't there anymore. These birds are gone, and they're not the last species we'll lose unless we break the pattern that ran through every story on this list. Every extinction you've just heard followed the same script. Humans arrived, brought changes the birds couldn't adapt to fast enough, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was too late. Right now, hundreds of bird species are on that same trajectory. These photographs aren't history, they're mirrors, showing us exactly where we're headed if nothing changes. If this video moved you, subscribe. There are more stories like these, and they need to be told. Thanks for watching. These birds are gone, but the forces that took them are still at work. See you in the next one.